questions will be uninformed, but if you want to.
I've got a lot of information.
Yeah. So yeah, we're live now, and welcome to the show. What we're doing today is a weekly series into the rise of the personal computing industry, and so today we're going to be talking about Michael Dell and my dad's.
Well, just to kick off with Michael Dell, because I just happened to show my son the annual family card. I think I have to call it because it was at Christmas, but it comes later now, from the Dell family. So I'm at least on their Christmas list. Now you're down at the bottom of the screen. I don't know if you know that. But yeah, well, I can't hear you now. How did I lose you? Okay, keep talking.
Yeah, so I'm here right now, and welcome to the show. We are doing a weekly series here with my dad and myself, where I'm interviewing him about the rise of the personal computing industry. And we are going to talk about Michael Dell today because my dad just got a card from Michael Dell, and apparently has had a relationship with him for a long time, and so interested to go into how you first met him and what his role was in the personal computing industry.
Yeah, I first met Michael. Wow, I have to see, work my way back, but sometime like in 1985. I have to go back and figure out kind of when Dell got started. But he got started Dell Computer Inc. And it was called Dell Computer because it was Michael in his college bedroom putting together computers and selling them, and which is where the original business model for Dell came from. Was he just kept doing that more and more over time, and to the point where they were selling millions of computers, not just like the tens that he could assemble himself. So he moved into a cheap building out of his dorm room in Austin, and that's actually the first time I met him, as I went and visited that assembly line. And it was lauded because he was doing assembly in the US, but still selling very inexpensively. Of course, all those components were manufactured in the Far East, and he was buying them from the lowest cost providers. But that's the way the PC was. You could do that. And he was the first one to figure that out, and then scaled it, because many people would start that way and then go and get the whole computer manufactured in the Far East. But he realized he could do assembly in Texas, in Austin, and which is where Dell Computer is still headquartered. So I heard about this young guy. I don't know how young he was at the time, but he was going to college, so he must have been like 20 or 21 and when he started the company. And so I went to visit him, and at the time he had I think it was an MGB. It was the soft top, so not the hard top, and it was an MGB GT, I think is what they were called. And so we drove around Austin, and I remember he had a scanner for police, and then he had a bunch of gadgets that were hanging off the dashboard. And he was a gadget freak, so he had a fine old time, and knew him back then. Now he's got, I don't know what Dell's valued at these days, but at some point it was worth $70 or $80 billion. He definitely fits into what I used to call my Silicon Valley asshole theory, except he was always the anomaly because he's a really nice guy. He sends cards to you every year, and he's open and friendly, and he doesn't yell at anybody, to my knowledge. Doesn't have a reputation for yelling at anybody, and yet he's built this massive company, only a very small part of which is now about assembling personal computers, if they do any at all. Now it's an enterprise hardware company that provides servers and software to run whole companies.
Kind of like IBM, or what?
Kind of like IBM. He's bought a bunch of companies in storage and servers and data centers and all that kind of stuff. So it's now an enterprise computer company, not like IBM in the sense that they have different products and different ways of doing it, but in that class of computer, like Hewlett Packard, like Cisco, companies like that.
What do you think? So for me, I'm starting to get the picture that there's a bunch of people all over the United States. It wasn't only focused in Silicon Valley, where they started to get together and started building computers and realized there's this new way of building computers that could go into everybody's homes. And it was kind of just all over the place. And it was people were tinkering and stuff like that. But then there's always been entrepreneurship. But what is the difference between computer-enabled entrepreneurship and entrepreneurship that came before it? And I guess what is the role of technology with entrepreneurship? Because there's also crap. Can you hear me at all?
Yeah, I can hear you. It's going up and down.
Yeah. So you can still hear me? Okay. So what is the difference, or what is the role of technology and entrepreneurship? Because there's also this entrepreneurship that is related to like small businesses, like a coffee shop and other things like that. And I'm not sure we're going to talk about that, but there seems to be all these different types of starting businesses. And what is the special, unique role of starting a business in the computer industry?
Well, you asked a bunch of different questions there, so I'll answer the ones I want to.
Yeah.
So always a skill you have to learn. First, I'll start by saying that a lot of the truly famous companies in the personal computer industry were actually not in Silicon Valley. IBM was in Boca Raton. I mean, their headquarters was in White Plains or where it was, New York, but the operation was in Boca Raton, Florida. Microsoft was actually started in Albuquerque, moved to Seattle because that's where Bill Gates grew up. Dell was in Austin, Texas. I can't even remember the name of the company, but it was a company that packaged its computers in boxes with cows on them that was celebrating the fact that they were started in somewhere in the Midwest. Sorry, I don't remember where. Gateway Computer, that was. And so there's a lot of different computer companies that were started that were not in Silicon Valley. The Silicon Valley came because certain key ones were in Silicon Valley and they were born out of the infrastructure there. So like Intel and Apple and going forward, many more. So the thing about Silicon Valley is the infrastructure around the companies and the number of resources available to start companies. But that was all technology. And that was actually all personal computer, because there had been a computer industry prior to that, which followed a particular pattern, which only a little bit of which was in Silicon Valley. IBM, of course, was in New York, and Data General and Digital Equipment were in Massachusetts. And so a lot of the big computer companies, companies made big computers, came from the East Coast. And that was not what Silicon Valley did. Silicon Valley started with Intel and Raytheon and companies that were either in other industries that migrated or that started as microprocessor companies. So that was totally related to the personal computer in the beginning in Silicon Valley. And then you can push that, but so then the phenomena that you know about and that other people more recently know about, which is the internet makes it really cheap to start computer companies. That same thing happened with personal computers relative to the way it was before. You had to go buy a Data General microcomputer or whatever they called it. If you wanted to start any business and you wanted to have computing as part of it, you had to buy these very complicated machines and hire staff that knew how to run them, and just for accounting and general ledger, much less for any other part of the operation. So over time, it's migrated from big computers, complicated, people in white coats taking care of them in the basement, to personal computers, which went, wow, we could for $2,000 buy a computer we can run our business on, to wow, we have local area networks and we combine these computers together, which never really happened. Wow, the internet, which is like this global high-speed network, which ties all of us together, and we can start doing data and all those things we've talked about since, to mobile phones, where all of that exists in your pocket. And so that whole thing from the sort of early 50s, when IBM really, Honeywell, called the bunch, so it was Burroughs, Univac. Let's see if I can remember what the bunch is. I can't remember what N was, or C or H. Anyway, Honeywell was H, but the bunch was the big computer companies in the 50s. Now IBM just smashed them, leveled them, had incredibly high market share. To the microcomputers or mini computers in the 80s, late 70s and 80s, and then the personal computers started in the early 80s. And that whole migration is, it's all history for us now. I just happened to plug in, and a bunch of new people plugged in with the personal computer. So it went along with, gee, you can run a business on this computer. They were different people. They were not the people from the prior generations of computing. and they tended to be young, which is why I got to know these people when they were young and unimportant. Relatively speaking, I remained unimportant compared to them, but they kind of accepted me because I was there when the industry started. So I have these relationships, and to tie it back to, Michael Dell, I met him within a year of starting his company, and he remembers that, and maybe I contributed value to him in terms of what I said. So he always values that, even though I've really had nothing to do with him for the last 10 years.
Huh. So the part that you said about him being a really nice guy and being able to start a big company is a really interesting one for me. The popular impression of somebody starting a company is like Larry Ellison, who's just kind of an asshole and really kind of yells at people and is just kind of a tough person to be around. Why do you think it was that? What was it about Michael Dell that was not that type of asshole, but was able to be effective?
Yeah, so the problem with my Silicon Valley asshole theory is that it's really not about being a jerk. And Larry Ellison can be incredibly charming. I mean, I had some very good times with him. And if he thinks he needs something out of you, it can be very charming. But then he can also be a real jerk and no self-awareness of the impact that he's having. And all of these guys can have those moments. Although with Michael, I've never heard of a story of him being a real jerk. But if you look at the history of Dell and the financings of Dell and how he went about building that company, he did all of the things that he needed to do to make it a big company, even though many of those decisions were very tough. He sold the company, he bought it back. He went into huge debt at one point to trying to remember what it was that Dell acquired. I think they acquired, anyway, there's a whole history of acquisitions where he really put himself out on the edge and risked complete failure to make Dell a big and important company. And then he's had to pivot multiple times because his original business model had nothing to do with the business that it is now. So I can tell stories about Michael, but our firm's reconceptualization of the whole idea of assholes is we now think about pigs. And pigs are, have I said this before?
You have, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think so. Pigs are people that are committed to the objective. And so here he still has Dell Computer, 40 years later, 35 years later. It's huge, multi-decabillions of revenue, operations worldwide. And he's worked his way through every stage of that and is still running the company. And that's the real definition, is that you have somebody that starts a company and knows where he's going with it, and what, I shouldn't say he, but they know where they want to go with it and make that happen over the long term and make the hard decisions, the tough ones, which often impact everybody around.
You often use the term critical path, and it sounds like that was talking about the critical path. How does a founder, or how do you know about the critical path? How do you find out what the critical path, or is that only something that you can kind of do with intuition?
It's you want to have them on screen and oops, there's a dog tail. I saw that.
Yeah.
The absolutely fundamental issue here is that they know and you don't, right? So if you don't know what the future contains, you can sit there and say anything you want. You can criticize or not or whatever, but they have a notion of what it is they're trying to accomplish. Now, the ones that end up running multi-billion-dollar companies and themselves are billionaires were right. The ones that didn't were wrong. So having a vision and knowing what it should be is not the only qualifying factor, but it is a critical path. So that's why I talk about critical path. It's a programming concept. Actually, it's a planning concept or a project management concept, but the programming needs it, which is you have to know what you're trying to accomplish in order to decide what all the components are and which ones are on the critical path and which ones are optional.
Very interesting. And then, so it seems to me, what do you think about, like, this is kind of a more philosophical question, which I've been going a lot more into my interviews recently, but what about the critical path for an individual? And does the critical path for the individual founders, is it aligned with the critical path of the company? Or does sometimes the critical path of the company misalign with the critical path of an individual?
Uber, WeWork.
Uh,
I don't really need to answer that question. It's the most recent examples, Webvan. I mean, it's like you can find examples of this through the history of both the technology industry and every other industry. So, that's why I say a founder who has a vision is not the sole requirement. You have to have a vision that's right.
Interesting. And then, so how is it to start computing companies, personal computing companies, and how is that different from technology companies or previous cycles of technology companies? Have you studied at all, like Ford or any of the other big companies, and how they worked and how it's different? Like, I was reading this Seth Godin email that he sends out, and he talked about both housing and cars have not changed in the last 100 years. They've just gotten a little bit faster, a little bit bigger, a little bit more expensive, but all things that are due to kind of like the normal laws of the material universe outside of the Moore's law. But then television, you could buy a television that's 49 inches for $300 today, which would have been a couple $1 million, 20 years ago. So what is it that's different about starting a company in something like that scales, as opposed to a company that, well, I guess cars scaled as well, but that don't rely on Moore's law?
You're kind of answering your own question while you're asking it. I love Seth. He's a troublemaker like I am. He says stuff just to stir up people, which is a good function to have, one that I fulfilled myself. We should take a moment to pause and just acknowledge that Clayton Christensen passed away yesterday. Part of that's the fact that he was 4 months younger than I am. So I'm like, phew, I like to see that. But he came up with a thesis, which is fundamentally accurate, which is called the Innovators Dilemma, which is directly relevant. So what you're really talking about here are incumbent companies versus new companies, regardless of domain. So Tesla, which just achieved a market cap of big enough to make it the second most valuable car company after Honda. Honda is still worth a multiple of Tesla, but they're worth like $100 billion or something like that, which is ridiculous for the number of cars that they produce. Relative to General Motors or some of the other big car companies, so starting a new company in an entrenched incumbent industry like that is very unusual. And there are many stories of people that have tried in the car business and failed. And people are still looking at Tesla somewhat skeptically. Some are, but some of them are believing that buying the Tesla stock at its current value, there's a reason for doing that. Which I don't totally understand, because I don't know how that company ends up being a multiple of $100 billion until it gets much bigger.
Until it starts selling more cars.
It's making cars, and it's doing it at scale, but it's doing it at a very small scale compared to Volkswagen or General Motors or Honda or Toyota, these other companies that are making millions of cars, not tens of thousands. Anyway, so the car business is particularly tough because of the capital requirements of building a factory, and you kind of have to do that. You can't get other people to build the components for your cars, which is true in the computer industry. So anyway, every industry is different. Banking, I mean, how the hell do you innovate in banking? But there are all these new banks out there like Chime and so on and so forth, and payment systems. So suddenly I thought PayPal kind of took care of that, and suddenly we have Venmo and all these other things going on. And these are industries I don't understand, and I don't know what the point of differentiation is, but there's always a reason for starting something new. That's why people raise so much capital these days to put into early stage. I think that'll come to an end pretty quick. But so I'm not sure if I answer your question, but every industry is afflicted by startups, and particularly now that the internet has kind of leveled the cost and complexity of starting companies.
But then there's just like an over kind of, you just alluded to it, but like so many people just starting something just because they can, and a whole bunch of money going into that because everybody recognizes that technology is anything that can be disrupted by technology might be disrupted by technology very soon. Have you noticed that in your investing, that it's just gotten crazy in terms of how many pitches that you're getting, or is it same?
Actually, the thing that I've noticed most recently is We used to have this thing called the do not call registry, and my phone number's in it. And yet every politician known to mankind is now calling me on my cell phone, not to mention all the relationship management companies and all these, new internet companies. So they've all got my email address and my phone number, and they are flooding me. And I'm going like, they don't even take the time to find out who they're sending email to or calling. They just call me randomly. And it's like, sometimes it's a robotic thing. There's no human being involved. Going, this is not a real value. Although from their point of view, obviously they're creating enough value. That's my pet peeve right now. I can show you that I get 2 or 3 calls a day from some random person running for Congress or Senate or whatever. And I'm going, that they really think this is effective, and it must be, because they must get it to enough people to raise money, because it's all based on numbers now about how many donations you can get to get into the debates and become a valid candidate. Anyway, that's a peeve. I even lost the question in the process.
Well, I mean, it comes back to technology, because it seems like to me, because I get those calls as well, but that might be because they're trying to find you and they get my name as well. And then but if if it is directed towards you, it means they're directing towards like high net worth individuals who can then and then that means they've just built a list somewhere, or that somebody sold them a list, and then they've got a database somewhere.
Sure.
And they're just,
and I just blocked their call. So this high net worth individual who doesn't have that high net worth, and is pouring it into a hole in New Mexico right now. I wish I could find a way to tell these people it's not worth their time to call my phone number, because they ain't going to get anything out of me. The only people I support are ones I already know.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Which goes into the whole why the introductions are so important as a founder, to get introductions to VCs, because they're flooded. And now I guess that flooding is almost even more, which goes into another factor of technology, which is wildly tangential, but also interesting, which is Instagram and most other social media companies are seeming to go from, it seemed to be that before we had a kind of a 20% to 80% distribution of people with attention to 80% not having attention. Now with social media, it seems to be going more towards 1% having the vast majority of attention, wealth, or whatever else, and then 99% not. And so Instagram has kind of changed the playing field when it comes to a million-year-old kind of way of mating, basically. And so like women are very highly attractive and can post on Instagram and then get a lot of attention through that. But then for men, it also works differently. I'm going wildly tangential here.
You're off the edge and falling into the soup.
Yeah. But it's just, and so where I was going with that was that basically you are investing capital, and seems to be in the same way that technology companies, like when this whole social media thing started, a lot of the VCs were the first kind of people with attention online on Twitter and everything like that. And it's just interesting because now you probably have a flood of people pitching you on stuff. I mean, you always have, but I don't know.
Yeah, I always have, and people are always attracted to where the money is. I'm completely aware of that. They believe that I have money and they can get to it. So so they've been pitching me forever. My problem is that the switch to my cell phone now, and which is a different path. And I used to think my number was a private asset, and that we had a general agreement in society not to use people's cell phone numbers. But the recent wildfires have been a really interesting thing in California. This is, as long as we're down a tangent, this is about as tangential to your tangent as your tangent was to mine. But the thing they've discovered is cell phones, of course, don't have an actual power system. If you had a landline, that thing was powered by a separate power grid, separate from the main power grid, so that if the main power grid went out, you'd still be able to use your landline. Well, with cell phones, if the main power grid goes out, takes down all the towers, then your cell phone no longer functions. And so it's one of the problems they're dealing with in both Australia and California. How do you keep people in touch if your cell phone is powered by the same thing and everything else is powered by when the power goes out? It's a really interesting evolution, because cell phones were never required to be universal, whereas landlines were. Anyway, it goes all the way back to if you give AT&T a monopoly on landlines, then they also have a civic duty to provide that to everybody. And that was the reason they had to provide powered connections, both in cities and rural environments.
That's really interesting. It reminds me of a book that I just bought about the invention of the telegraph, and I haven't read it yet, but I'm really interested to it because I've been talking about remote work, and somebody was like, World War II was fought remotely, essentially. So it was fought via
It was a communication system that previously had not existed. But AT&T, if you'll remember, stands for American Telephone and Telegraph.
Interesting. Yeah. So what is and you've invested in things like Wicker for communications and stuff like that. What is your understanding of the relationship between technology and communication, or in what ways does communication influence the rise of technology, or how important is communication to the rise of technology? I think that's the best question.
Well, kind of lost me in the modifications there. Wicker is really not about communications. It's about privacy and security, the degree to which you can protect your communication and make it personal and not have a government looking at it, which is a different issue. So I don't think that I would say that we invest in communications because it's an incredibly complicated domain, one that requires a lot of capital. Again, any more than we'd invest in a car company, we wouldn't invest in a communications company, i.e. somebody that builds all the internal capabilities to move signals from one place to another, which, obviously means we also miss some really big opportunities, but we don't do that kind of thing. And, there you get into sort of philosophical territory about the universality of communications. I mean, we have a company, I have a company in our portfolio that is building propulsion for satellites. And part of that is because there are these people out there that want to put up hundreds or thousands of satellites to create a whole new communication system that can work in remote areas like Africa and Southeast Asia. And there's 5 or 6 of them that are, the leading of which right now is SpaceX with its Starlink subsidiary, but there's also Amazon, OneWeb, and Telesat, and there's a bunch of other players in there trying to create these networks of satellites that are all about communication. So but there's also networks of satellites about capturing images, about doing a bunch of other applications. So we're not investing directly in communications.
And so if they set up that united satellite communications network, then the problem you mentioned about wildfires would actually be solved by that, essentially.
I wouldn't say it'd be solved because there's a whole nother set of things that have to happen on the Earth, the network on Earth.
Yeah.
There's inherent latency in communicating with space. So having expense. Cost anyway, so that's a complicated answer to give.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go back to Dell for the last 5 or 10 minutes. What was that first meeting like with Dell when you went to Austin? Can you describe more about that?
Sure. I mean, I met him at the headquarters of Dell, which at the time was some crappy office in a shopping mall. He still had his college car. I'm pretty sure it was an MGB GT. But the GT, I think, was the hardtop, so maybe it was just an MGB. He'd remember. And so he wanted to go on tour of the factory. Scott was a guy that wrote a newsletter, right? And I had a reputation. And so if I showed up, people wanted to show off their businesses and talk about them. And that's what Michael was doing. But it was very early on before people were paying much attention to him. This is totally an insider visit. And so we did that. We went on a tour. We went to several of his factories. I hesitate to call them factories because they were basically, and there's nothing profiling or racial about this, but it was true. There were a bunch of Mexican workers, migrant labor, that were standing in a row on a table assembling all the piece parts of computers, which ended up being labeled Dell computers. It was not a very sophisticated operation. In fact, it wasn't particularly hygienic or safe. And so I hadn't gotten big enough to attract the attention of, OSHA, which he did eventually. And they cleaned up their act and their factories became very, or their assemblies, or whatever you want to call them, became very sophisticated and clean and huge. I mean, I also went to visit Combat Computer, not on the same visit. They were in Houston, he was in Austin. And their factories were, assembly lines were very sophisticated, because they started with manufacturing in the Far East and migrated the assembly to the US, based in part on what Dell had done. So, you know, there was a process there for people learning. And what was clear is, from meeting Michael at that time, was that he was, number one, really smart, right? And agile. He wasn't sitting there taking book learning and figuring out how to make a new microprocessor. He was figuring out how to make this process work. And his enthusiasm level was unbounded. He drove very fast and wasn't paying a whole lot of attention to where he was going, which made me extraordinarily nervous in the passenger seat. So, you know, to the degree that you thought that might be predictive of his success, he was a guy to pay attention to, which I did, and I think that's what he appreciated.
Interesting. This is probably a good time to wrap up. I haven't. It feels like I haven't been on my game today, but it'll be.
You're a little spacey. That's okay. I'm kind of spacey too. So.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm actually going to be off for the month of February, so I don't think there might be a chance we could do one in mid-February or something like that, but you'll be in Chile, I think. So
I'm flying to Chile on the 12th, so which is a Wednesday or Tuesday, something like that.
So we'll start these up again probably in mid-March, probably March 14th or March 15th would be the next one.
Get back to the US. Yep. It's approximately when you get back, right?
Yep. So thanks for everybody for tuning in. And